I'm going to do something different today. I keep having these really interesting conversations with this guy named Nimkii Brad Howie. He's a member of the Nipissing First Nation. He's trained as an environmental scientist. He's a professor at Niagara College. He teaches everything from environmental sciences to Indigenous studies classes. And we always have these really neat conversations, and I just wanted a place to put those things so that other people could learn from them. So I've invited Brad here today. Brad, how you doing?
I'm doing fantastic. How are you doing?
I'm doing well too. And I thought I would just like to start. One of the things that we've talked about before that I've just gotten a lot out of is talking about this very special place, Crawford Lake. And of course, Crawford Lake is it's in the international news because it's been sort of isolated as this spot where we can say that the Anthropocene starts because it's got these really nice layers at the bottom of the lake and you can see where the nuclear age starts in the 1950s. But it's got layers that go back farther than that. And it cuts right back into indigenous communities using that land before sort of the Western explosion of technology hit that place. And so what are your thoughts about Crawford Lake and why it's a special place?
Yeah, well, that's a fantastic question. I'd figured I'd just go over a little bit about Crawford Lake because I actually used to work at Crawford Lake a
Hmm.
couple of years ago before I started running my business full time. And initially, I was hired as an education coordinator, and then I became basically just the manager of Crawford Lake. And so Crawford Lake, of course, has Crawford Lake, right? Now, Crawford Lake is also a known archaeological site. And within that site, there was a longhouse village where specifically Indigenous people, First Nations people, Wendat or Attawandaron people lived. Nobody really knows. But we've created three longhouses there that are meant for teaching. But the lake itself has just some incredible properties. It's a really tiny lake. If you actually ever go and visit it, it's in Milton, Ontario, so about an hour outside of the GTA. And you could walk around the entire lake in like 20 minutes, 15
I
minutes,
have.
depends how
Yeah,
fast you walk.
it's so small, right? It's surprisingly
Yeah.
small. You'd think that a place that's like internationally known would be this great big huge Great Lake, but it's just a tiny little thing. But it's deep and it's got these great layers at the bottom.
Exactly. And that's part of like the specialty of, I suppose, of the lake. I mean, to me, we'll get into this, but I think every lake is special. But Crawford Lake is what's
Hmm.
called a mirromictic lake. So essentially it's got two layers that don't mix over time, and that's basically just because of the structure of the lake. It's like a big cone. And then even a little extra crinkle to it in one very specific part of the lake. It's got this really amazing sediment that basically captures global and atmospheric chemistry dating back to when the sediment first went in. And the sediment is a really, really weird thing. It's actually called a colloidal fluid. You might like this because it's basically like a gelatin. And you think the bottom would be like Swiss cheese, when you're taking sediment cores out of it, it looks like Swiss cheese. But actually, when you put a sediment core into it to take a piece of the sediment to study it scientifically, what happens is it reanneals instantly. So it goes and it slaps back together in the exact same way. And it's just like sticking a butter knife in like green jelly. When you take it out, it'll just slap back together really quickly. And that's the sediment that has been proposed to mark the start of the Anthropocene epoch, basically.
Right. Yeah, and so you've got this really special place that scientists are all excited about. But when you talk about Crawford Lake, I mean, you've spent all this time there, and there's the sort of significance of the place. And I mean, you've talked about it as a mother, right? You've talked about the lake in a totally different context from the way I'm used to thinking about lakes as a scientist. So can you tell me a little bit about that?
Yeah, it's really quite interesting because I myself, I'm half Indigenous. I'm half Anishinaabe from Nipissing First Nation, but I didn't get to grow up in my culture, for various reasons, and so I started to engage with my culture a lot more in my 20s. Now I'm closer to 30, and I went to school to train to be a chemist, and then I went to school to train to be an environmental scientist for graduate school. And yeah, just like you always think of the environment as an it. You think of these other beings as things or objects or as its. When I'm writing down in English, I always want to say something, but it always comes out as it or that thing or something, right? But when it comes to indigenous cultures, and I say that in not of a pan-indigenous way, because North America is very, very big, and even the First Nations and what's now the Northeastern Woodlands, or what we call the Northeastern Woodlands, were incredibly diverse. But one thing that binds us together is the way that we looked at other beings, the way that we looked at landscapes. And they had personhood. They had their own um, spirituality to them. They had, uh, like I was saying, personhood, basically. And when it comes to Crawford Lake, no matter what Indigenous groups or First Nations people, Métis, Inuit people that we had worked with, consulting with, when we did the sediment extraction, because I was a big part of that process too, um, everyone referred to Crawford Lake as their mother, and that is something so different from, an Indigenous science or Indigenous lens versus more of the Western science or Western lens.
So this focus for you, this shift from the scientist, I mean, you're still a scientist, right? I mean, you're still teaching environmental science at Niagara College, so you're still totally in that world, but you've branched out to learn more about your history and Indigenous culture, and you've started this business, Minoman Learning, which is bringing that teaching and that learning to the broader community, because there's a huge appetite for that right now. Can you tell me a little bit about Minoman Learning and how that works?
Yeah, there's not only a huge appetite, but I think it is really something that should be, weaved in respectfully within to our science and our society as a whole. So, Monoman Learning is a business that I own and operate, and it's all about teaching professionals, people, students, and teachers all about Indigenous people, perspectives, science, and ways of knowing. But as a scientist myself, I really like to integrate those scientific ways of knowing. And I feel like that's kind of that's my business niche, or I like to say that's my uh, economic niche instead of environmental niche. You know what I mean? But it, I think it is really good for society as a whole because when it comes to Indigenous science and Western science, I mean, this was a thing that I didn't even think was real. 15 years ago when I was training to be a science. I was so narrow-minded, but my mind has really been open to a lot of other things. And of course, there could be other forms of science. And what is science at the end of the day? It's all about asking questions about natural phenomenon, whether they be biological, physical, chemical. That's all it is. And in essence, you have some sort of method to create reproducible results. So if you have questions that are being answered and they're reproducible, well, that's science, right? And when it
Hmm.
comes to Indigenous people, every Indigenous group around the world, and I can say from my expertise, I suppose more so here in the Northeastern Woodlands, we had an incredible amount of science, an incredible amount of knowing. However, though, the difference is what I was talking about, that path, When it comes to Western science, there's a very specific path. It's called the scientific method, and there's peer review, and there's all these things, right? But there's a path in Indigenous science too, and we call it the Mimino Bimatsuin, which means the good path, you know? And I feel like that's the big difference because a big thing that's changing in science nowadays is the whole idea of sustainability and making things not only you're doing science in a good way for humans, but you're doing it in a good way for everything. But that's always been a part of our science, and maybe that's something we can reintegrate, and I mean, I could talk about this for a long time, so
Yeah, I mean, well, you do talk on something that is changing in science right now. So, I mean, in the olden days, you just had questions and you did your research and you had these hypotheses, and there was no sort of value judgment on it. You sort of just took the answers as nature provided them to you. But increasingly, with environmental science, certainly, we start with this set of values, right? That diversity is good to preserve, that we don't want things to go extinct. And then we work to find ways to make that happen, right? And so it's not impartial. It's not just this cold hard, well, I guess that animal just doesn't, I guess black-footed ferrets just don't have what it takes, so we'll just kiss them goodbye. And that's just the way the world works, and we're learning about it. That's not how science is working. And so I think, whatever you want to call that, Western science or European-based, originally European science, is starting to branch into these ideas of values. And so there's a lot to learn here from a group or from a bunch of groups who have been having storytelling and values sort of weaved into their exploration of the world. So let me ask you about the word storyteller, because I know that's a word that comes up a lot when we chat. And you've talked about the lake as a storyteller. How is thinking of the lake as a storyteller, what does that do for our understanding that we don't get if we're not using that perspective?
Yeah, I mean, like I said, I worked with the scientists. They're fantastic scientists, and I worked with a lot of scientists throughout my career. And, they talk about the lake like any scientist would. It's an it, it's an other. It's not this kind of living being, right? But when we talk about the lake, like I was saying earlier, we talk about the lake as having, personhood, and specifically as being a mother, and being a mother that's nurturing to all the beings that live there. And kind of to my point earlier, I think that's important thing because um, imagine if you start a scientific uh, research question and you're doing all of this work, you're gathering information, you're thinking about sustainability. Well, what if you start from point A? What if you start of thinking of that being, as a mother, instead of just as an other, as an it? It would change so much about how you're engaging with that research space, what your environmental ethics would be. Now, specifically, the reason that we call the lake a storyteller is because that sediment, the I like to say it's kind of cheesy, but that the lake, speaks not with English or with any language, but speaks with their sediment, layer by layer. And that's something we have to listen to. And in fact, all beings speak to us, you just have to listen to them and hear how they're communicating. But specifically with the sediment, I mean, there is so many stories that can be told through that sediment. Like I said, it captures both local and global atmospheric chemistry. So whatever's going on, in the atmosphere right near the lake versus in the Pacific Ocean, right? And so there's so many stories, and I feel like that's kind of part of the big story missing, which is that we've only really focused on the Anthropocene and these kind of plutonium spikes that are found in the sediment dating back to the 50s. But the sediment goes back thousands of years, and imagine how many stories, how many environmental problems, how many environmental implications can you take from that sediment and can you learn? It's a incredible what we would call a resource, but what I would call a gift.
Yeah, I mean, frankly, to science, it's a gift too. I mean,
Yeah.
we've looked all over the place for these, for signals and noise, and looking. I mean, figuring out that a asteroid wiped out the dinosaurs comes down to finding a sediment layer that had iridium in it, and looking at these layers in Crawford Lake. Scientists really understand not just the Anthropocene better, but also, we could see corn pollen from hundreds of years ago that shows that people were farming corn in that community, before Western contact. And so there's a lot to that. A lot to that story, a lot of stories that come out of it. It is super interesting, and I love just sharing ideas with you and just getting a sense of sort of how you perceive these things and how you're integrating it with science. Because I think for a lot of people, it feels like there's this separation, right? There's like this indigenous way of knowing, and then there's the scientific way of knowing, and we just are not going to be able to find middle ground. Do you ever feel like that tension exists? Do you think that it's a tension that has to be overcome, or do you think that it's just a figment of everyone's imagination? Actually, they work quite well together.
Well, it depends. I think at the end of the day, when you look of it objectively, they should exist together, and they do
Mm.
really complement each other in a lot of the ways. I like to say that Western science, when it comes to the environment, really provides almost, it's like you're doing a puzzle and you have all the pieces, except you're missing two or three. And then when you fold in that indigenous science, it's like it completes the picture. And I don't even think there's just a disconnect with science, Western science and indigenous science. I think there's a disconnect between science and I guess just general people and the public.
Mm.
And that's something I try to do with my business too, because science is hard. Like you're reading these Anthropocene things, you're like, what's an epoch? What's plutonium? What's all this other stuff, right? But something beautiful, another thing that comes from my culture and from our language, Anishinaabemoan, is the word for education. And our word for education is Aki no Magewen. And it doesn't really translate to education. What it actually translates to is like teachings from the earth, you know? And when you
Mm.
think about that in a Western context, that's geology, right? But that's a beautiful thing is that you didn't have to be a scientist to know about all the beings in the environment, how to farm, how to do all this other stuff. You just had to be human, right? And that's what I'm trying to do with my business too, is try to take out that kind of preconceived notion that science is really difficult or hard to understand and kind of fill in those gaps. And I'm always about accessibility of information.
Okay, so let's talk about your business just a little bit before we go here. Monoman Learning, tell me what Monoman means and tell me who your clients are. Like what kinds of groups are you bringing this learning to?
Sure, sure. Do you have about an hour? No, I'm just kidding. Monoman learning. So Monoman in English means wild rice, right? And that's even a teaching within itself. A lot of people didn't know that there was, just like there's rice native to Southeast Asia and eaten all over Asia and now the world, there was also rice native to the Great Lakes region, and it tastes
Hmm.
quite similar, and except it's actually I have some right here. It's black instead. And this was a cultural food staple for us. But like I was saying, Monoman doesn't really mean wild rice. It truly translates to the good seed. And that's what my business is all about. It's about planting the good seeds, more specifically for education. And I've been able to work with environmental agencies, environmental organizations like conservation authorities, school boards, even things like law firms. So I'm just
Hmm.
kind of working with everyone under the sun because I feel like a lot of what I'm teaching can be very applicable and very useful for people to know, outside of just, being, Canadian or North American and kind of learning about the history. It's stuff that I feel like you can take parts of this, plant your own seed for it, and that could be something that can grow into, a new train of thought for you to think about how you're doing your business or your profession in a different way.
Now, what I like about your attitude, it's just such a welcoming attitude. You're willing to work with anyone, and you're just having lots of great conversations with people like me, people in all different branches of the world, just to sort of just make this way of perceiving the world available to more people, so they can take what they get from it and maybe have it change the way that they do stuff. So, let me ask you just one last question before we go. Like, when was the last time you were out at Crawford Lake, and do you see it differently now that it's been the focus of attention? I mean, you were working there back in the day before it got famous. You knew it back before it was a big deal. So, or maybe it was a big deal for different reasons, but does it feel different now?
Well, it's certainly kind of always been a big deal. And one thing that was amazing is that we kept a list of people who came there in the summer from other
Hmm.
countries. And one summer there was 92 countries that came. And so people who live in Milton or the GTA, it seems like when their family comes and visits, this is a place that they take them. So it has been kind of a locally famous place, and now I suppose more of a globally famous place. But I have been back there. Um, and it always just brings up the same feelings of just kind of, I don't want to sound funny, but kind of just love and peace. It's a very peaceful spot, and it's really amazing. And it always makes me think of, do you know the concept of place and space?
I mean, I know what those words mean, but I don't know if I know the
Yeah.
concept. Tell me about it.
It's a term in environmental planning or environmental policy or environmental science. And basically, there's place, which is the physical environment, and then there's space, which is how humans put importance on it for spiritual reasons, cultural, religious, maybe even like your family's been fishing there for 10 generations and you don't want it to become like a oil factory or something. So there's this difference between place and space. And whenever I go back to Crawford Lake, now that Crawford Lake has kind of shifted from a place to a space, because now it's of global scientific importance, now it should be protected in perpetuity. But the thing I always think about is how come we don't just value it as a living being, as a mother that's nurturing to everyone? Why do we have to say it's a place or a space or it's important or it's not important? I feel like just like human beings, we all have dignity and we deserve respect. I feel like beings in the natural world and also landscapes in the natural world, they should kind of have that too. And that would change so much if we kind of shifted our perspective in that way.
Amazing. I think we should leave it there. That's a really nice sentiment to leave it on. So, Nimkii Brad Howie, thanks for your time.
Yeah, no problem. Thank you so much.